Hey guys, Coach Bob here. Thanks for joining me for the video cast. Today we are continuing our series of closer examinations of the codification of cultural traditions. Today specifically, we are looking at philosophical alternatives. These are traditions that are ethical codes. In other words, tell people how they're supposed to live their lives and decide what is right and wrong, and they are codified, written down in central texts, but do not technically meet the definition of a religion. The symbol that you're seeing is obviously the yin yang symbol. This is a very old symbol in China. It does not represent a particular religion, but rather a basic idea that is common throughout East Asian thought, and that is the balancing of everything. Now, in the terms of the East Asian philosophies, you'll remember all of them develop in the context of the Warring States period, this horrible time of chaos. Daoism, Confucianism, and Legalism, the founders of these belief systems, of these ethical codes, are all living in this time period. So they're intensely concerned with trying to create order out of that. There's another tradition, though, that I'm only going to talk about briefly in the Mediterranean. And you might remember that after the Persian Wars, Athens is gaining prominence and it has a golden age, the age of Pericles, it's sometimes called, where a tradition called rationalism begins to grow. And that idea is spread from the Greeks to the Romans and then will be passed along on in the tradition in Europe, as we'll see later on. But here's the thing, in all of these cases, they have core text, like these ideas, these principles are written down, but they are not considered sacred scriptures. And while you could make the case that some of them come really, really close in terms of like trying to describe some sort of mystical experience we associate with a religion, in none of these cases do the people claim that they are either a god or speak for the gods, or the source of this text comes from the gods. So again, they serve the same function as a religion, as an ethical system, but they are codified, but not technically religions. So the first one we're going to talk about is Taoism, founded by this guy, Lao Tzu. Now you'll see his name spelled this way in various sources. You see this a lot. There's several different systems for trying to translate Chinese characters into English. Also notice that his name ends in ZI. I'll come back to that in a moment. We know when he was born, but we're not exactly sure when he died. And I'll come back to that in just a moment. There's also a tradition in China that Lao Tzu was Confucius's teacher. And while theoretically that might be possible, we don't have any actual evidence that that's the case, but it's a very common tradition. Now, the central text for Taoism is called the Tao Te Ching, which is usually translated as the Book of the Way, the Tao meaning the way. The interesting thing about this, though, is the book is a book of poems that Lao Tzu himself wrote. And there's a fundamental contradiction there, that he's trying to write about something that can't be written about, but the only way he thinks he can even come close is through poetry as opposed to prose. We'll come back to that in just a moment. There's several key concepts, though, about Taoism that we need to get. First, Tao. Obviously, it's Taoism. Tao is usually translated as the way. It's a much more complex idea than that. Ultimate reality is one way that people think about it. The first cause of the universe. In some ways, it's kind of seen as being similar to the idea of Brahman in Hinduism, but it's just the way of the universe. Chi is another concept which is usually translated as force or sometimes life force. Uh, you might be familiar with the idea of the force in the Star Wars movies. That was very deliberately copied after the idea of chi until they got into the midichlorians thing. That was just a total disaster. But there's this force that flows throughout all living things, and the last concept though is Wu Wei, and I don't want you to write anything down yet because there's several different ways to think about this, and you decide which one you want to write down and which one has more meaning to you. Because again, we don't really have such a concept here. Sometimes Wu Wei is translated as letting nature take its course. But another way to think about it is, which is one I like, the art of doing nothing, of not acting so that you let nature take its course, so to speak. So, like, this was always my favorite, when my mom was yelling at me because I was supposed to be doing something else. I'm like, I am doing something. I am practicing the art of doing nothing. That didn't go over well with her. A more contemporary version of this is just go with the flow, right? Just let the force of nature take its course. Pick one of those that means more to you to write down, but putting these concepts into larger ideas is what we mean by principles. The basic principle for Taoism is humans are naturally good. Human beings are born naturally good. The problem is culture removes us from our natural state. That is to say, traditions, customs, laws, according to Lao Tzu, these are the things that cause the problems. The irony there is those are the things that we think of as being part of civilization. So basically, what he's suggesting is that it is civilization that is taking us away from our natural goodness. Therefore, if you want to achieve harmony, if you want that balance that's represented by the yin yang symbol, the first thing you've got to do is reject formal learning. Now, that's kind of ironic given that Lao Tzu himself was a teacher. He had a formal education, but then he argues well, you got to leave that stuff behind because that's just teaching you how to get further away from your nature. What you need to do is learn to trust your instincts. Your natural instincts are the key. That's the way, he says. More practically, he's literally advocating for getting back to nature. I mean, there's a kind of element of Taoism that there's this kind of hippie idea, just like get in touch with nature, man, and like let's all go out in the woods, and why do we need clothes anyways? Let's just get naked and play hacky sack out in the woods, and it'll all be great. Um, the impact of Taoism socially is not so great as it is in some of the other ideas that we'll see. The big impact that it's had is what we call life cycle events. Um, Birth, death, marriage, things like that. Chinese people tend to get Taoist priests to perform those rituals. Partly, I think, because they're seen as part of the natural course of a human life. Um, they're compatible with Confucianism. And this is something we'll come back in the next unit. Like, we tend to think of like you got to pick one belief system or another. And in China, that's not exactly like they can coexist in the same person. So for many people in China, like Confucianism is maybe how they live their daily lives, but then Taoism is like a thing that is, relevant for marking different periods through the course of the life cycle. One significant social impact it had is the Yellow Turban Revolt, which you might remember from last week. It contributes to the decline of the Han Dynasty, but what does that have to do with Taoism? Well, the the Yellow Turbans were a Taoist secret society. They were like this underground religious movement, if you will. And the people were said to have supernatural powers. And this is something we're going to come back to later on. Like the idea was that Taoist priests had so become in tune with nature that they could actually control nature. So, like, they could fly, they could like turn into animals, things like this, that, you know, whether or not it was true, people believed that it was true. And so the leaders of this revolt claimed to have these supernatural powers. In truth, what they're really rebelling against is taxes. During the Han Dynasty, the tax structure got so heavily placed on peasants that they revolted. So there's a political aspect of this, a practical one. Taxes are just too high, but it's led by these Daoist priests who claim and are believed to have supernatural powers. Now, the revolt is put down by the Han Dynasty, but if you recall, it's one of those things, internal problems that signal the decline of an empire. In terms of influence and expansion, though, the biggest influence within China is definitely cultural, specifically in the arts and architecture. The architecture of Daoist temples, for example, becomes a very common feature throughout Chinese um, society, or culture, I should say. Poetry and calligraphy is a big one, though. The landscape paintings, such as the one you're seeing right now, become a sort of common motif throughout Chinese culture. It's very heavily influenced by Taoism. A couple of things I want you to notice in this image. First of all, notice in the top left corner is a poem. But if you notice, there's a single figure at the top of that cliff. That's like the individual out in the natural world, in this case, like up above the clouds, being one with nature. That sense of awe at what nature provides. But you might also notice down here is a temple. So this is definitely a Taoist influence. But again, that idea of mixing poetry and landscape portraiture, whether it's painted or drawn or whatever, that becomes a common element in Chinese culture, but it's very heavily influenced by Taoism. I mentioned the architecture already. Another key, medicine and alchemy. Now, alchemy in the West, in Europe, alchemy is this idea that you can take base metals and mix them together and somehow make gold. But in the East, you can take natural elements, they believe, and find the elixir of immortality. This is what the Taoists were really interested, like understanding nature so well that you could combine different elements to produce immortality. Now, as we'll see, one of the unintended consequences of this is that will eventually lead to the discovery of gunpowder. And as you would well imagine, gunpowder is going to change the course of world history completely. So we'll come back to that later on. The other thing to note, though, is Taoism never has any influence beyond China. It is only seen as a Chinese influence. Next up is Confucianism, which is actually started by this guy, Confucius. You'll see the ZI at the end of his name again. Confucius is what the Europeans called him because they didn't, understand what was going on. That's what we call him now. That wasn't really his name. And if you notice, there is an overlap. Like, he was alive at the same time that Lao Tzu was. Again, we don't have evidence that they ever actually met. He worked his whole life as a teacher, as an editor of texts, and he really believed he had found the way to get out of all of this chaos of the Warring States period. And he thought of himself as like, I should be advising the kings because I can help them. None of them would hire him. And so instead, we get this central text called the Analects, which the best translation is really the conversation. Because what's happening in the Analects is his students are asking him questions and then recording the responses. And they're the ones writing them down. But there's no like it literally comes out of the conversations between his students and him. And again, he thought, I should be the advisor for all the kings, but instead I'm just a teacher. And in fact, he died in poverty, and it wasn't until well after his death that anybody fully appreciated what he was trying to teach. Well, what is he trying to teach? Well, there's several key concepts that you need to understand. The first of these is Ren, which is usually translated as benevolence, which is like a feeling of good. But what he's saying is that there's a natural desire in every person to be good. Human beings want to be good. Junzi is a concept, it's usually translated as superior man or righteous man. That is to say, somebody who is actually living good, doing the right thing is Junzi. Li is proper rituals. Now, ancestor veneration is a really important idea throughout Chinese culture, but there's an interesting passage in the Analects where one of his students asks about what happens after you die. And he says, frankly, I have no idea and I don't care. But to him, Li, the proper rituals, he said, we perform the rituals to honor our dead ancestors, not because we know like what happened to their spirits, but because that's the thing that unites us. Like we as people perform these rituals for their social value, not because of whatever it is that we believe happens after you die. The most important concept, though, is Zhao, which is almost always translated as filial piety, literally meaning the righteousness of the son. Filial, if you take Latin, you'll recognize that. Piety, this idea of righteousness, of doing the right thing. So the righteousness of the son is a key concept. That is to say, like son and father, not the sun and the moon, is a key concept here. Why? Because what Confucius is basically teaching is if you want order, you have to know your place in the social order, and you have to respect your place in the social order. This is represented perfectly in something he calls the 5 relationships. Now, you do not need to know the 5 relationships. What you need to do is identify the pattern here, okay? So the first relationship is between the ruler and the subject, the husband and the wife, the father and the son, older brother, older friend, younger friend. Now, again, you don't need to know these 5 things, but look at what's going on here because there is clearly a hierarchical relationship. The person on the left is superior to the person on the right, okay? And you're supposed to know which side you're on and act accordingly. But if you also notice that the arrows extend in both directions. So for example, consider the ruler and the subject. Clearly the ruler is superior to the subject, but the arrow goes both ways. If you consider for a moment in China, we know the mandate of heaven is given to the ruler so long as he actually does good by his subject. In other words, yes, it's a hierarchical relationship, but not only does the person on the lower end of that have an obligation, so too does the person at the top. So, like the father and the son must obey the father at all costs. In fact, in a really interesting discussion with one of his students, Confucius actually says that a son should lie if that means protecting his father. But he also says the father is a bad father for making his son lie. But the son has to protect the father at all costs. The father should provide, the safety and security for the son. Again, it's a hierarchical relationship in every case. Somebody is superior to somebody else, but there's an obligation in both ways. In terms of the principles, his basic idea is humans want to be good. We are born wanting to be good, but you have to learn how to become good. Therefore, you got to train them to know their place. That's the whole essence of Confucianism. Know your place. Every single thing around you is a social relationship. Your duty is to figure out what is the relationship and how are you supposed to act. That means things like observing the rituals. We do those because that's how we act. We acknowledge our ancestors, and so we do the rituals because that's what we're supposed to do. It also means education is crucial. How are people supposed to be trained to know their place in the social order and act accordingly? Well, they have to be taught. That means education becomes a crucial part of this. That in turn leads to the biggest social impact, which is the hierarchy that is produced out of Confucian thought. At the top, you'll remember, are the elites. The scholars are at the very top of the social hierarchy. These become the bureaucrats, the officials of the government in the Han Dynasty. They are at the top. Below them are the gentry, the wealthy landowners. They get their wealth passed down from generation to generation. But notice they're below the scholars. And we'll talk about this more because there's a potential problem with the what's called the scholar gentry problem, where certain families become so powerful that they can control both the wealth, the economy, and the government, and that is a threat to the social order. We'll come back to that idea later on. In terms of what we would call a middle class, interestingly, peasants and artists are in the official Confucian hierarchy in the middle, not at the bottom. Peasants are supposed to be honored according to the hierarchy. And then at the bottom are what Confucius calls the mean people. And this is where it gets interesting. The merchants are the mean people. And here's Confucius's thought. First of all, we need merchants because we need trade. That's just part of, living in a society. But he also says, and it kind of makes sense, merchants care more about profit than they do about doing good, about being a junzi, about being morally righteous. And so what he's saying by the mean people, like, we need them, but their moral condition puts them on the bottom. Similarly, for some thinkers, soldiers are down there. We need soldiers, but like their job is to kill people or threaten to kill people. Which that is very interesting too when you consider how in the Qin dynasty, Qin Shi Huangdi, like, soldiers were all that mattered. So that social hierarchy becomes ingrained in East Asia in a way very similar to what the Varnas in South Asia do. And it's going to last throughout the remaining years of Chinese history. In terms of patriarchy, though, there's also another significant idea called the three obediences. This means a woman obeys, obedience, right? First, her father. When she is a child, she must obey her father. Then when she gets married, she must obey her husband. If her husband dies, she doesn't have to throw herself on the funeral pyre, fortunately, but she must obey her older son. So again, the basic idea, what we see in the Confucian patriarchy, is in every single case, the woman is attached to a man who is her superior. In terms of influence and expansion, obviously this becomes really a big deal during the Han Dynasty. It is then when, like, officially Confucius and his teachings become seen as these great central ideas for their society. He's the guy, Emperor Han Wudi is the guy who establishes a canon of core text. Like, these are the books that we call the Confucian classics that are supposed to teach you how to become a good person. Of course, you'll remember that the way to test for that, the examination system, is then used to determine the government officials. It does expand beyond China in the next period, the post-classical period, into Korea and Japan, but with some significant differences. We'll look at that more closely. The third is legalism. That is started by this dude, Han Fei Tzu. And by the way, the ZI at the end means master. Just as DI at the end of an emperor's name means emperor, it's a title. Sometimes you'll see it spelled this way. You'll notice he's still in the Warring States period, but later than Lao Tzu and Confucius. He writes a book called the Han Fei, which I find really funny. That kind of cracks me up. Like, hi, I'm Brian Popovich. This is my book, Brian Popovich. But that's what it is. He writes it himself. It's in his own name. And this becomes the basis, if you recall, for Qin Shi Huangdi, the first emperor. But remember, it doesn't actually go away after Qin Shi Huangdi. I mean, a lot of his ideas, Han Fei's ideas, are going to be rejected, but the key one is that idea of a strong central authority becomes incorporated into the Han synthesis. So what are the key concepts? There's only one concept: authoritarianism. Follow the rules. That's all you got to know. You don't have to think. You don't have to believe. You don't have to do anything except follow the freaking rules. Why? Well, these are the principles. Han Fei says you're bad. All humans are bad. We are naturally just bad. You need somebody to tell you what to do because you're so bad. The law is the main way to do this. Here are the rules. Here's what's going to happen to you if you break them, and then you punish them. This is obviously against intellectualism. So like the Confucian idea that like books matter and education matters, that's the exact opposite for legalism. Like you don't need to think, you don't need to know anything. Shut up and follow the rules. Morality, irrelevant. You don't need to know what's good or bad. What you need to know is follow the freaking rules. And if you don't follow the rules, we're going to punish you severely. That is the law. A very, very, very harsh, strict, almost brutal way to try to create order out of chaos. So again, let's sort of review real quickly. What all three of these thinkers and these schools of thought that grow out of their key texts are concerned with is creating order out of chaos. In the case of legalism, law and punishment is how you do that. In the case of Confucianism, teaching people how to behave properly in terms of their social relationships is how you do it. For Daoism, hey man, let's all go out in the woods and, enjoy nature. Now, very quickly, I want to talk about another philosophical tradition that has an impact, but all the way literally on the other side of the world in the Mediterranean, and that is rationalism. Rationalism is the belief that reason is the way to truth, that reason is how you figure out what's right and what's wrong, what's true, what's false, what's good, what's bad. Reason is the way to do it, according to rationalism. And again, this begins in the golden age of Athens with Socrates, who was a philosopher. He was a teacher, in fact. He didn't write any of his texts down. It was his students, namely Plato and Aristotle, who you've probably also heard of, who teaches that the unexamined life is not worth living. He says you should question everything. Why do we do what we do? And if it doesn't hold up to reason, then maybe we shouldn't do it. The answer to that question then is you got to use logic to figure out, is that actually true? So again, the idea that like you question everything, use logic to answer, implies reason is the way to figure out what is true. This idea of valuing reason so much would spread Alexander, his teacher was Aristotle, who was a student of Plato and Socrates. So, like, there's a direct transmission there. When Hellenization happens, spreading Greek language and culture, that idea that reason is the way to truth spreads, and then that becomes adopted by the Romans. So, there's a pretty direct line there. One thing real quickly I want to mention about this. Didn't the Greeks believe in gods? Of course they did. They were polytheists. So why did they also have this tradition that reason is the way to truth? Well, consider their gods for just a moment. Zeus is a perfect example. Like, that guy was just not a morally good creature, right? I mean, he had sex with anything that he possibly could, and he would do whatever he could, even though he was married. Okay? In the mythology of the Greeks, like, their gods are not good. Like, how do you follow the example of them when their example is morally suspect? So there's this kind of sense that you need an ethical system to figure out what is true and what is false, because the gods are clearly liars, or what's right and what's wrong, because you can't just look to do what the gods do, because many of them are just not good creatures. So again, I'm blowing through rationalism pretty quickly because I've already gone much longer than I wanted to. You've got more information on your chart. For those of you in my class, the focus questions will involve the text that we've been working on. I want to thank you for your attention. I apologize for the lesson being too long today, but thank you for your attention.